this lesson is chapter 4.6. I have a B here, but again, it's just 4.6. It has a few skills and ideas you need to learn. The information may not seem to connect, but it does wrap up our unit. Again, this is the last section of our day, of our chapter, with the test coming Friday. Tomorrow I'm going to probably give you a test, so make sure you show up tomorrow. Not a test, but I'm going to give you a version of the test to take home, look at on a video, and then kind of study from. First thing you need to understand, again, domain is the x values of a relation, and range is the y values of a relation. A function itself is a relation in which each input has exactly one output. Again, those are three definitions. The main two you need are these, but again, a function is just something that every input has only one output. But let's just look at some processes first that you need to understand, and one of them is called function notation. So if I was to ask you, what is this statement here, the way it is read is, what is f of negative 3 for the function f of x equals x squared plus 3. First off, understand this is not f times x, this is a notation. So f of 3, that's read f of x, and what it's telling you to do is pretty much change your x into a negative 3. So you simply put a negative 3 in for there. Negative 3 squared is 9, because remember, negative 3 times negative 3 is positive, and so your answer would be 12 if you were asked to do that. So again, when you see function notation f of x, you could even see g of x, you could see t of m, anything like that is just function notation, and what they want you to do is change whatever your variable is into whatever number that they put on the inside. Alright. Another thing you'll be asked to do is to identify the domain and range of a relation, which really shouldn't be that bad, just because all it's asking you to do is just give the values themselves. So keeping in mind that domain and range represent x and y, the easiest way to remember them is that if you alphabetize domain and range, this is first, that's second. Well, this is the first number, the first letter of your ordered pair. So your domain would represent the values in order, no repeats, of negative 2, which is the smallest, 1, 4, and 5. So that's what they want to know. So again, your domain is negative 2, 1, 4, and 5. Your range, again, the second word in alphabetical order, represents the second letter in that list. So you start again smallest to largest, which would be negative 4, 3. You don't need to write the other 3 because there's no need to list repeats, and 6. So again, typically whenever you do your domain and range, you want to put them in order. Now there is a question on your homework that doesn't follow this rule, but that's just because I programmed it, so I didn't know how to put it in order the way it's supposed to be. But again, you will get the idea whenever you do that. But again, if you're simply asked to find domain and range, and this is a test question, which means all you have to do is make sure you understand what it's asking. Domain again is your x values, range is your y values, no repeats, and put them in order. If you're asked to find the range for the given domain, what they're saying here is find the second letter, which would be y, for the given first letter, which is x. So we are giving you x, can you find y? And all this is asking you to do, and again, this is the one that's on your computer work today, is you take these values and you simply do 2 parentheses negative 2 plus 1, which is negative 4 plus 1, or negative 3. Then you do 2 times negative 1 plus 1, because you're simply plugging in the negative 1 now. That becomes negative 2 plus 1, which is negative 1. And then you do 2 times 3 plus 1, which is 6 plus 1, or 7. And so your range would be negative 3, negative 1, 7. In other words, they are giving me 3 numbers to plug in. They want to know what numbers come out, and that's really all it is. Alright. So again, that's another question you're going to definitely see on your test, that you're definitely going to see on Friday, so make sure you're ready for all that for when it comes in there. Another topic must be learned for the concept is reasonable domain and reasonable range. A reasonable domain and a reasonable range represents a realistic, that's what reasonable means, realistic values that can be used for a function. Remember when we made tables for a word problem in the previous lesson, we talked about something like the profit earned from selling fruit at a stand could be modeled by a function. We talked about how x represents the numbers of pieces sold, and it does not make sense to sell negative pieces of fruit, which means you cannot have negatives. It actually doesn't make sense to sell any negative values, but again, it is possible to sell 0 pieces of fruit. Another thing in terms of reasonable that we probably didn't talk about is, would it make sense to sell 1 million pieces of fruit at your stand for the day? No, there's no way you have 1 million pieces of fruit in stock and that 1 million people are going to show up in 24 hours and actually buy it. So again, when you're talking about your reasonable domain, your reasonable range, you're talking about numbers that make sense for the actual problem for what it is. And it's not this deep. Like the example I just used does have a slightly general sense, but it's not nearly as tough as what it sounds in that statement there. A reasonable domain, this is where your notes are, is a set of values that can be expected in a situation. A reasonable range is a set of results that can be expected from using the domain values. So the most important thing for you to find is the reasonable domain. Once you have your reasonable domain, that will give you your reasonable range, because remember, domain plugs in to give you your range, or your domain is your x. So once you know what values of x you can plug them in to find out the values of y you can use. Alright, so again, you must know the reasonable domain before you can calculate the reasonable range. Alright, so closing out this lesson really quickly, here's your example, and again, it's just like the example in the computer. You have 3 of these. Make sure you work on your fluency, because it's not hard to find, but you do have to actually remember how to arrange your question or your answer. So you're selling something called candidates at a park. You will earn 67 cents on each candidate sold. You have ordered enough supplies for 250 of those. The function P of C equals 0.67. C represents the profit P you earn for each candidate C sold. Find a reasonable domain and range for the function. So what we're looking at here is, again, domain and range. Domain goes in, and the number that we're looking at that goes in is we would be plugging in for C. So again, in terms of domain, we are looking for number of candidates that we can sell. And if you look at it, it says that we ordered enough supplies for 250 of them, which means that we should have a high point off of that, which means you can't sell more than 250 of these. Here's the other question. What's the lowest amount I can sell? Well, I obviously can't sell negative anything, but the lowest amount I could sell if they were just terrible or people didn't want to buy anything is 0. And so your domain on this problem is 0 is your lowest number, and you have to know how to do that compound inequality, is less than or equal to, because again, you can equal 0. C, because that's the variable we use here, which is less than or equal to 250, because again, I can sell 0, but I can sell it as low as 0, but I can sell up to 250. The key thing for some of you to remember, especially for those of you who kept messing up on your test last chapter, is that these should both be pointing to the left. In other words, the smallest number is over here, the biggest number is over there. The alligator is eating the bigger number. This is smaller, this is taller, and that's the tallest. So again, make sure you do it that way. Your range, though, as I said, you have to have the reasonable domain to get your reasonable range, and your range comes from your formula. And so if I sold 0 candidates, how much money would I make? Well, 0.67 times 0 is, of course, 0. Use the actual function part, which is P of C, for your middle. And then you just have to find out what the high number is, and you do that by simply plugging your high number here. If I sold 250 and made that much money, I would do 0.67 times 250, which is 167.5. So what this is telling me is, in terms of numbers of things that I can expect to sell, it's 0 to 250. In terms of money I can make, because remember P is profit, I can expect anywhere from 0 profit to $167 profit on this certain situation. Alright, so again, quick lesson that puts us at about 9 minutes or so. So again, your final thought here is study as much as possible. Again, especially if you're behind. I have never seen a student pass a test with a B and fail the quarter, because typically that B is a good sign of, you know, making good decisions and at least working really hard. And I don't think this material is too tough for all of you. I just think that some of us aren't taking it as seriously as we can. So again, it's less important that you finish your homework than it is that you can recall necessary strategy. Glance through your Math Excel homework at some point before Friday and make sure you immediately know the strategy. If not, then you need to spend more time with it. Again, you can do this at home. It's online. I even think you can get on Math Excel on your phone. So there's really no excuse for you not to know how to do particular things. But again, other than that, just make sure you get ready for this test, because again, I don't need this test putting a lot of you in a bad position. Other than that, Math XL is waiting, and good luck.